If you'll join me, we'll go ahead and begin. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Take, Lord, and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, and my entire will. All I have and call my own, you have given all to me. To you, Lord, I return it. Everything is yours. Do with it what you will. Give me only your love and your grace. That is enough for me. Amen. In the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Letter stickers and different font.
I do. Not right now, though I don't. So we have 3 objectives today. By the end of class today, you should be able to explain the 4 goals of progressivism. This unit is titled Progressivism, or the Progressive Era, and we haven't actually talked about what that term means yet. Progressivism is like a social movement that comes out of like people feeling like the country is really broken, like it's really deficient. You've got all the corruption in government, things like graft, which we learned about last unit, and you've got, Boss Tweed and, city bosses, and you've got the stalwarts who are cheerleaders for it, reformers. There's a feeling that like the country, guys, it's a feeling like the country is really broken and there needs to be something to do to reform it. And that's where the progressives come in. They're trying to advance the state of the country. You may close your laptops. You don't need laptops for this section. So our first objective is you should be able to explain the 4 goals of progressivism. We identify 4 things that generally the progressive movement supported. Second, you should be able to summarize progressive efforts to clean up the government. And so we'll talk about approaches that happen at the state or at the local level. And then we'll talk about, you should be able to identify progressive efforts to reform the state level government, but also reform efforts for workplace reform and election reform. So today we've got kind of the roots of the movement. And we'll begin in Roman numeral number 13. Oops, I'm on the wrong page. There it is, row number 13. Okay, so the concerns of the progressives. In the early 1900s, middle-class reformers wanted to try to address all of the problems in society at the end of the last century, so the end of the 19th century. By the 1890s, it felt like the country was really broken, and there was this big effort to reform it. And it's worth noting that progressivism is not a single movement. It's not like everybody that calls themselves a progressive cares about these same things, but these are all kind of the issues that are considered the progressive era. So it's a collection of different kinds of reform efforts that we all group together to call. That we all group together to call them progressives. Hi, yeah, welcome back. So reformers, basically, there's 4 essential goals they've got. They want to protect the social welfare, just look out for people, to promote the general welfare, to create economic reform, so to try to open the doors economically to more people. You also see a movement towards promoting moral improvement, to just make people better people. And you also see, what's the one that doesn't initially seem to make sense? The scientific kind of efficiency to it. The progressives are sort of the feeling that we can get better at all kinds of things, and they'll use whatever are the logical tactics to get there. So there's this scientific efficiency to it as well. Okay, let's begin with the first one of promoting the general welfare, promoting social welfare. And we see this is rooted in the social gospel movement. So our social gospel movement from our last unit that says that the whole purpose of Christianity is to promote the well-being of society, which that is important to a Christian. It's of course not the whole purpose of Christianity. Christianity is not a charity organization, although it we should do charitable works. But nevertheless, the social gospel movement inspired other reform groups. First we'll talk about is the YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association, which was about developing, like, I don't know, activities. They're like handball courts and pools and just things in cities for the urban poor to do. So the idea is just to have something to do, have some recreation in your life. And in particular, focuses on cities. Progressives are kind of urban based. It's about the movement of the cities, which has been kind of a significant topic for us the last few weeks, the growth of cities. Populism, if you remember populism way back in our first unit of the year, populism is a rural movement. It happens on the farms. But progressivism is an urban movement. So you see YMCA's grow up in cities. The other thing we'll talk about is the Salvation Army. Now the Salvation Army is actually a Christian denomination. It's a religion. Salvation Army, there's people that go out and ring the bells and you put the thing in the black or the red kettle, right, in Christmas time. That's actually it's a religion, Christian denomination, who really takes, I think, heroic charity. I think we can say soup kitchens. They're working in nurseries, taking care of young children. They had what they called the slum brigades. I don't think they would probably use this term today if they were starting out. Like, let's go into the slums to try to teach immigrants and people new to the country, like American middle-class values, things like, a Protestant work ethic and the idea of temperance. Now, temperance has a lot of different uses. To say the word temperance means a lot of different things. In this unit, we're talking about temperance as moderating or stopping drinking alcohol. Okay, it's not necessarily prohibition, which is a law that it's prohibited, but temperance is like a personal thing, like the desire has been tempered. Okay. Last person I want to talk about before we move on is Florence Kelly. Florence Kelly was a political activist. She was an advocate for women and children. She even was promoted at some point to the chief inspector of factories in Illinois, so pretty important woman in a time where women didn't have a lot of the access, that she basically made her own access to it. With her leadership, they also helped pass laws prohibiting child labor and limiting the hours that women could work. She was also considered one of the co-founders of the NAACP, which is a movement for African American people to get greater rights. She's not African American, but she helps advance that cause. Subpoint C, I want to talk about moral improvement. Other reformers said that promoting the general welfare is important, but really what matters is what a person's behavior is like. What's their moral side rather than their workplace conditions or their life conditions. They believe that the poor should uplift themselves by improving their own behavior, and in particular we have a further focus on alcohol. So reformers believed that alcohol was undermining American morality, particularly groups which were vulnerable to alcoholism, immigrants and the urban poor, which frankly they lived really hard lives, and a lot of people did try to find some consolation in the bottle. It's a pretty hard life. But these kind of reformers, the moral reformers, were really advocates of prohibition or to outlaw alcoholic drinks. Now I want to say this is a sidebar to this because we often get this question. Even during the era of Prohibition, we're not actually there yet, but in the era of Prohibition, alcohol was allowed for medicinal purposes. So it's a chemical solution that can dissolve chemicals in. So make medicines. There was alcohol in medicine a lot of times. And then there were sacramental allowances too. So for religious purposes, a person could still get alcohol. But that was a very small segment of the, it's not really drinking. It's used for a particular purpose, yeah.
Why were there slums? Was there just not enough jobs for everybody to work? Or?
Well, the jobs didn't pay a lot of money. And so they're just living in poor conditions. Yeah.
But they didn't have good work. They're
Yeah.
24 hours and you get paid like a couple bucks.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated situation, but basically the jobs that were available just weren't very good. They didn't pay very well. I mean, I don't know what ratio of work to payment, but just wasn't a very good income. I put this picture is kind of famous among social studies teachers, and I've put it on every American history class I've taught for a decade now. And I got to be honest, every social studies teacher I know uses this photograph to describe this moment in history. And I'm curious what your impression is of this picture. When you see this, what comes to your mind? We'll just do this as an open thing. What do you got? Yeah, what do you think?
I don't think my lips would touch any of theirs anyway.
Okay, so the sign, lips that touch liquor should not touch ours.
Yeah,
So
I don't think
you're just like, I wouldn't kiss any of the ladies anyway. Yeah, there's some, you may not be okay with saying this, but I'll go ahead and say it. Those are some ugly women. Right? Those are some gnarly looking ladies. Yeah.
Especially the one on the left. I thought that was a guy.
This one over here, that's what everybody says. They're like, that's an old man.
They making funny faces or something?
No?
That's just their face.
I don't think they're expressing emotions, just some of them that just like don't exist.
Like what? What are you talking about?
Like
Like that woman looks like she's
the one woman like right to one to the right,
the one
To the right?
like down
Down?
again.
This? Here?
Yeah, that
she
one.
looks like she's sucking a lemon.
Like I just don't know what that face is.
Like, what expression is this?
What emotion is
What do you think, Reagan? What do you got?
There's like the women's like protest that we see today.
Okay.
There's the women that like protest.
Okay. Looking kind of angry.
And then they have the poster.
Posters. Okay. I'm going to let you in on a little secret, something that I didn't know. I don't know if I should admit this while I'm recording this. I didn't actually know this until I'd showed this picture for probably 3 or 4 years. None of those are women. They're all men. Now you totally see it, right? They're all men. And it's not like 1900 drag queens. They are mocking the Prohibition movement. The Prohibition movement was almost entirely women, and they're making fun of it to say like, oh, the only women that would like Prohibition are kind of gnarly women.
Oh, is that lips that touch liquor shall not touch our liquor.
Yeah, the point of it is to make fun of the Prohibition movement takes all of the power out of it. It strips the movement of its like credibility. If you're like, well, yeah, only old batty women want Prohibition. Like it totally removes the power of the movement. I actually feel kind of bad that I taught for years thinking like, yes, this is the Prohibition movement. Whoops, that's a bunch of dudes.
The guy front center does one heck of a job.
Here?
Yeah.
We're very good at lipstick, sir.
That's
I've taught that too. We'll move on in this piece. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, was a women's organization which was all about promoting moral reform through prohibition. And when Frances Willard, this is a woman over here, when Frances Willard took over Women's Christian Temperance Union, she turned it from kind of like a small, you guys okay over here?
Yeah.
Okay. Kind of turned it from a small, marginal organization to, by 1911, had nearly 250,000 members, and was a real promotion of the temperance movement. Here you go. Okay. Some immigrant groups rejected prohibitionist efforts. So, in particular, European immigrants that came from countries with a culture, like a socially acceptable type of alcohol drinking, like Germany with beer culture, or France or Italy with kind of wine culture. It was not really the same drinking culture that was showing up in American cities. It was just a really different, cultural piece. I keep saying that word. But so a lot of immigrants felt like it was kind of like personally attacking just immigration, not about approaching alcohol. And there was also a pretty big crossover between countries that were traditionally Catholic and ones that had an alcohol culture to it. And so it gets mixed up with religious baggage and a feeling like it's not racism, but kind of like an ethnocentrism kind of baggage, and it all sort of gets wrapped up. And then there's another part that I think is really underrated, and it's the role that saloons just played in the cities. Yes, they served alcohol, but when people are living in tenements or in slums, there's not often a lot of good access to food, and kitchens are pretty substandard, and a lot of times saloons just served meat. They were restaurants, and you needed a place to go eat. And when not everybody had a bank account, and so they would take on a banking function of cashing paychecks and just kind of making transactions happen. So saloons kind of took on a role beyond just serving booze. They also had a social function in the community. Okay, our third goal of progressivism is economic reform. In 1893, there was a financial panic. We've talked about it a couple of times in the unit, never really very in depth, but in 1893, there was a financial panic that made people begin to wonder if the whole economy was going to fail. It felt like the entire American capitalist system was built on a shaky foundation, that financial panic of 1893. And so you have a lot of people trying to explore alternate economies. And here's where I want to reintroduce Eugene V Debs. We have met Debs before. He was in our last unit. What do we remember about Eugene V Debs? What do we got in here? I'll come back to you. What else we got? Eugene V Debs. Yeah, what do you got?
He started the international something, like a group of people that
He headed a group of what?
like African Americans and socialists. No, that ain't it.
I think you're circling around it, but we'll be more specific. So Debs was a union leader who led the Pullman strike. Okay, so you remember the Pullman strike making the rail cars, the Pullman cars? And Pullman lowered a bunch of people's wages, but didn't lower their rents. Debs was the labor leader who led that strike, that Pullman strike. So we've met him before. In 1901, Eugene V. Debs starts a new political party. He splits from his, I actually don't know what party he was from, but he goes off and starts a new political party. And in 1901, Debs founds the American Socialist Party. So socialism felt very different in 1900 than it would by 1930, and certainly than it would by 1950. Today, Americans have kind of a weird relationship with socialism. There's kind of a revival of it that's coming up in American politics. People like Bernie Sanders is just openly a socialist. He's a democratic socialist. So there's kind of a revival of it today. But in the 1900s, it felt kind of promising as an alternative to traditional politics. So anyway, he starts the American Socialist Party in 1901. It's worth noting that most progressives were not socialists. Most progressives were not socialists. Debs is kind of fringy on this one. But most progressives would have agreed that big business was an economic problem, that it was driving out competition in the workplace, that it was unfair to the little guy. So there is kind of this this feeling. One last thing I want to say about economic reform is there was a movement of journalists. There's a secondary movement of journalism that comes up called the Muckrakers. Muckrakers were investigative journalists who focused on business corruption. There's a few of these that got real famous. Upton Sinclair was a muckraker. You had a question of them in your Flappy game that you were playing. Upton's a boy's name. I know it's not obvious, but Upton Sinclair was a muckraker. And then Ida Tarbell, who's in your notes here, Ida Tarbell took on an investigation of Rockefeller of Standard Oil. One time, the richest person in America, one of the richest people in the whole world, Rockefeller. Ida Tarbell began a series of investigative journalism to point out that, or to accuse him of really underhanded business, saying that he basically cheated his way into that wealth. Ran a monthly column, later turned it into a big book. Okay, the one that doesn't fit of the goals of progressivism is a movement towards efficiency. And the best way I can kind of think about this one is, I don't know, progressivism felt like the future. It felt like this is the way it should be. And so it's all based in this idea of I don't know, science and progression. So anyway, where are we at here? Progressive leaders hoped to use scientific principles to affect the society. The example that we'll begin here with was a Supreme Court case, Mueller versus Oregon. We'll talk more about it here in a few paragraphs. But Mueller versus Oregon was where Mueller was suing the state of Oregon to get a law changed. Oregon had a law in the books that said women were only allowed to work 10 hours a day. It was a progressive, okay, so this is going to be hard. How do we walk through this? Today we wouldn't, I don't want to start that way. It was a progressive issue to say that women shouldn't work so many hours. Today we would not think of it as a progressive issue. But the thinking was at the time that women are the ones who bear children, and so society has an interest in making sure that women are protected for the future of the country. And so if women work really long hours, it's just hard on a person. It's just hard on a person's body. It's just hard on their makeup, right? And if they're carrying children, then it's also hard on the future. So the feeling was that it would be progressive to protect people, the most vulnerable people, people like women, right, who are much less vulnerable than big, powerful business. And so it felt progressive to say a 10-hour maximum. Anyway, this gets argued all the way up to the Supreme Court. And a young attorney, Louis Brandeis, makes his case in court. And he takes a different approach than usual. Brandeis doesn't go and start citing legal cases. He doesn't roll out this is the law, here's how it's been interpreted in this case of so-and-so, and this is whatever. Brandeis just says hey, here's the social science data. This is what we should be doing. It's very different than what lawyers usually do, which is argue about cases and laws and stuff. When Brandeis does this, he makes a whole new model of litigation, a whole new way of lawyering. And they should name it after him. They call it the Brandeis Brief. Brandeis would later go on to be named to a Supreme Court justice. Brandeis University, I think in California, is named after him. A fancy law school. We'll get this and we'll take a 2-minute break. F.W. Taylor, who looks like a pretty exciting guy, wrote a book called The Principles of Scientific Management. And F.W. Taylor, in his Principles of Scientific Management, says, if we make businesses more efficient, then we can work fewer hours. And that's good. And we might even be able to pay people more money because they get the job done more efficiently. That was F.W. Taylor in his book, Principles of Scientific Management. So he would watch factory floors and watch how people would move while working on an assembly line and would try to shorten up their field of work and try to narrow it down so they wouldn't do so much moving around. It could be more efficient to do so. And it was successful. It shortened the workday and it raised paychecks, which is good. The problem is that Taylorism, as it became known, also kind of dehumanized people. It turned people into parts and really just it was nothing exciting about the job anymore. They're just doing one task all day long. And it led to, like, athletes that do the same motion over and over again get repetitive motion injuries, right? People were getting hurt at work by doing the same thing over and over. They're doing more of it faster, getting paid more, which is not nothing, but getting hurt and kind of hating their life while they're doing it. Okay, we're going to take a 2-minute pause. Okay, good. Welcome back. Welcome back. Commercial break. Welcome back. And we will resume with Roman numeral 14. Welcome back. Roman numeral 14. These are a couple of pieces of reform that began in cities, and I'm going to mention 2 in particular. What? Someone at the door. Who's this? Welcome back. We're going to talk about social reform that happened in a particular, not social reform, government reform that happened in a couple of particular cities. We'll begin with the city of Galveston, Texas. In 1900, Galveston was hit by a huge hurricane. In 1900, we didn't really have a way to measure or predict hurricanes the way we have now. And there were like reports from sailors saying that there was a very large storm heading in, and it looked like it was pretty much on the path towards Galveston. And as it got close, but you know, there's no meteorology as we know it was not developed in 1900. It was, yeah. But it became increasingly clear that there was going to be a huge storm that was headed right towards Galveston. And the people of the city of Galveston decided that they actually couldn't evacuate fast enough, but thought that if they told people there was a storm coming, they would just create a panic. And so Galveston officials just agreed not to tell anybody and let what is probably the largest storm to ever hit that part of the country just hit without telling anybody it was coming. The town was basically destroyed, but when they're in their rebuilding, the city of Galveston so poorly managed the rebuilding effort that the state of Texas came and actually fired all of the city council and just gutted the city government and just took over. And they invented a new model of government which would be based in commissioners, that you would elect a person who would have a particular job in the city. So like Batman has the police commissioner, you know, right? What's Commissioner Gordon, right? That kind of job was invented with the Galveston hurricane, where somebody would hold a job in a city whose particular role was narrowly defined. And you could elect them, so there would be a police commissioner and like a trash commissioner and whatever else. It was so effective at putting competent people, specialists in the job of rebuilding the city, it was so effective that other cities began to copy the Galvestonian model. And by 1917, 500 American cities were using that Galveston model of commissioners. As far as I know, I don't think there's any city kind of around us that uses this model. There's no city in Johnson County that I know of where you elect commissioners. There are some jobs you elect, like Johnson County, you elect a sheriff. I always thought that was really dumb. Like, well, yeah, sheriff is an elected position. Like, so they have an election, and there's people that have campaign posters and like, vote for Sam for sheriff, right? And Sam's campaign pledge is to be tough on crime. But everybody promises to be tough on crime. There's nobody running for sheriff. It's like, we're going to let him go. Go, you guys. Like, everybody promises to be tough on crime.
How do they usually do it?
What's that? Sheriff would, the other model would be that it's an appointed position, that the city, that the county commission goes and hires the sheriff, yeah.
You get a cool car for it.
That's true. There's a different model that we'll talk about before we move on from here. Dayton, Ohio had a different disaster. They had a flood that came and ruined the city there. Rather than appoint commissioners, Dayton decided to do a different tact, and the city council hired a manager. They just hired a professional to actually run the business of the city. And today, I think that's kind of the main model. I think most people, I know I think every city in Johnson County, there's a city council, but they hire a manager to be like the city manager who actually does the professional work of the city. And that actually comes out of Dayton, Ohio, and a few years after the Galveston hurricane. Yeah. So like City of Lenexa has a city manager, and he's like the CEO of the city. Okay, subpoint B. I want to talk about a couple of mayors with reform-minded approach. And we're going to begin with a person that has my favorite name in all of American history. Hazen Pingree. One day, Mr. and Mrs. Pingree were holding their beautiful baby boy and gazing into his eyes and said, "What a beautiful child. What should we name him?" And the other one says, "Hazen." Oh, that's it. You said, come on. Why would you name anybody Hazen Pingree? I'm sorry if I'm making fun of this and like you've got an Uncle Hazen. And
He's so serious.
well, he was the mayor of Detroit. He had to be tough.
His face is like, oh,
Good one.
This is back when Detroit was not the worst city in America. And
What was the worst city in America?
I don't know. I mean, that's Detroit now.
Dodge City.
Detroit's totally the worst city in America. It's the Topeka of our nation. Really. All right. Hazen Pingree, we remember him because of his work in like cleaning up the reform of the city of Detroit. He lowered transit fares, tried to make it easier for people to live there. He basically approached city management as we should have a city for poor people as well as for rich people, and was a real reformer in that effort because he says it wasn't all like big business and rich people shouldn't run everything. So he's the leader of the reform on the city level, Hazen Pingree. The next person I want to introduce you to is Tom Johnson of Cleveland. He was a mayor, and he was one of those successes of the Socialist Party. So he was a socialist elected mayor of Cleveland. And we remember Tom Johnson because he started using the term is to nationalize a business. It's where it is a private business, but the government comes and takes it over and runs that business for itself. So electricity, KCP&L. I just changed its name. It's Evergy or something now, but it's a business, and like people own stock in KCP&L or Evergy, right? It's just a regular business. But if it was nationalized, then the city of Kansas City or the state of Kansas, the state of Missouri, would just take over that company, and they would buy out all the shareholders, and they would just run it as a city service rather than a private business. That's nationalizing. Anyway, Johnson did this in Cleveland. He nationalized the gas works of natural gas, the water works. He took over some transit lines. And very socialist thing to do, to say that the means should own to the people, should be run by the government. But a reform-minded mayor of the progressive era. Okay. What's that? That's a dude. Yeah, that's Robert La Follette, the 3-term governor of Wisconsin and later U.S. Senator from Wisconsin. They called him Fightin' Bob. Fightin' Bob La Follette he basically took on huge businesses. The railroads were his particular target. And again, in this movement of like the progressive era, it was big business has too much power. We need to lower big business, lower the power of big business to raise the power of the little guy. Don't be annoying. Okay, thanks. We'll talk more about La Follette in just a minute. He had some specific contributions to political history. Child labor was another reform effort that comes out of the progressive era. I look at this picture and I think, that girl, how old is that girl?
11.
Yeah, so, like the consensus is somewhere in like the 8 to 11 range. She's tall, which makes you think she's a little older, but she's real skinny. Whenever you see pictures of child labor, they're almost always working in a spinning factory where they make thread. I don't know, there must have just been a subject because they worked in other industries too, but you always see them in textile mills. Kids were pretty valuable to employers for a couple of reasons. One, you don't have to pay them very much because kids are bad negotiators. Okay, I'm going to give you an example. This isn't in your notes. When our children were real little, I had to try and hire a babysitter come over so Mrs. Wahlberg and I could go out. And I asked this babysitter, I said, how much do you charge? How'd you babysitter? How much you pay a babysitter? And she says, oh, whatever you want. Okay, I would like to pay you $7 and half of a cheese pizza. That's a total. I'll be back at midnight. I don't know what that means. Whatever you want. That's bad negotiating, babysitters. You should go on and say what you want. Say well, I work for $25 an hour and I get to drive your car, right? Or whatever, right? You set a price and let the other person decide.
Well, is that what you pay?
No, it's not. You wouldn't want to drive my car anyway. It's a Toyota from the Bush administration. It's not exciting. Okay. What's the going rate for babysitters? Lay it on me. What's a babysitter charge?
Depends on the kid.
Okay, let's say hypothetically you have a pretty great 9-year-old daughter and kind of a crappy 6.5-year-old boy, just hypothetically. Okay. $10 an hour.
For each kid.
If you have 4 kids, it'll be 12.
What's that?
If you have 4 kids, it'll be
Okay.
It goes up. And at the age. So if they're really little, like babies.
Right. But the older they are, the cheaper?
Yeah.
Because kids put themselves down? No. Just keep them up till midnight. Don't start any fires. $8 quid kid vaping.
It's the best gig.
What's that?
It's the best gig.
Babysitting?
Oh, yeah.
All right. Anyway, kids were valuable workers. One, because you don't have to pay them very much because they're bad negotiators. And two, you don't have to pay. The other thing is that they are small and nimble and that they can work around complicated jobs. So this job is a spinning machine. You've got all these bobbins full of thread up there. And it's very fast and the thread comes flying through. And when the bobbin gets full, you've got to slide it off the little spindle that it's on, put a new one on and rethread it and it'll start filling back up again. And you got to have small, nimble hands that you can get in there and pull those things out. I am old and fat. I'm not very nimble at all. This machine would be very hard for me to run. But I bet this 10-year-old girl can really do a great job on that machine. Now, it's not built with any safety equipment. She's got to climb on it, which is why she's barefoot, so she can climb up onto it really easily. You'll notice she's wearing her hair into a ponytail, because it is a spinning machine with thread and people would get their hair caught in it. It would actually pull them into the machine and rip their scalp off. Or hands could get cut pretty easily. People lose fingers in it. But the good news is they're kids, and it's easier to replace children because it doesn't take as long to make one as it does to take an adult. I hope you guys don't think I'm serious. I'm glad I'm recording this class. Good. But the thing is, though, families oftentimes had to send their kids to work because, as we talked about earlier, there's not people making a lot of money. And so every person that can contribute helps. So families need their kids to go there, or families feel like they need to send their kids. Employers feel like they need to hire kids because they're good on the machines and you don't have to pay them very much. And this is like a win-win unless you're the kid. And I love this sign over here. They're these kids, we want to go to school. It's so opposite from right now where you're I want to go to work. It's so opposite. I like this one. More schools, less hospitals. I think we should have both. I think that seems like not an either or. Yeah.
Is there a minimum wage?
Nope.
The companies
Pay whatever you could negotiate. Yeah, no minimum wage. That wouldn't come out till the 30s, the idea of a minimum wage. Yeah, so
What was minimum wage?
I don't know. We'll have to look that one up. Yeah.
Wasn't this like when 50 cents per dollar was like a lot?
Yes. Yeah. Inflation hadn't quite got the dollar like it had later. So what looks like a small wage would have just been more money. It just would have been worth more money. Yeah. We want to go to school. I like that kid. All right.
School free?
Public schools would have been, yeah. Yeah. The limiting working hours, I kind of hinted at this earlier when Brandeis introduced the Brandeis brief arguing for lower work days. Today I don't know that we would consider this to be a progressive case, to think that women just shouldn't work as hard as men. I think today modern progressivism would say that men and women are functionally equal and they can both work the same kind of hours. But it was a progressive era back then to say that women were a protected class and should be treated differently in the workplace. It's a legal principle called protectionism, and it would have been kind of the default approach until, I don't know, the late 60s or early 70s, and there was a kind of a movement to end protectionism after that. So Brandeis convinced the Supreme Court of the United States, the SCOTUS, Supreme Court of the United States, to limit women's work to 10 hours a day. There was another case, it's whatever the next one is in your notes, I'm blanking on what it is now, but that it applied to men also. Okay. In terms of election reform, and this will be our last major topic that we'll talk about here, there's a movement still, and this is all progressivism, to take the power of the big guy and hand it down to the little guy. And there was 4 changes that happened in elections which would do this. The first 5 things that would change in elections. Let's talk about the first one. It was called an initiative. They said, we expect our Congresses to go pass laws for us. And this is at the state level, not the federal level. We expect Congress to go pass laws for us, but sometimes Congress doesn't make the laws we're looking for. And so they introduced this idea, it's an invention of the progressive era, called an initiative, where people will write a bill, and they'll put it on the ballot, and if enough people say, yes, let's debate this, they will pass that bill on to Congress, who will then debate it and either pass it or not pass it. But it basically forces laws into Congress's hand to go do something with. That's an initiative. Similar to that are states that have referendums. And a referendum exists where, like, people write the law and they put it on the ballot and they vote yes or no on that law, and it becomes law and just totally misses Congress altogether. And just the people pass the laws at the voting booth. There's a third reform that comes out of the progressive era called a recall election, and it's a take-backsies vote. They're like, every now and then people elect a person and then change their mind later. States have recalls, not every state, but a lot of states have recalls. They say a person elects a governor, and then a year and a half into their first term, they say, ooh, kind of a mistake, shouldn't have elected that guy. They can hold a recall election, basically remove that person from office. Kansas technically has a recall law. I don't know that it's ever used. It's very narrow in what a person could be recalled in, so it's very narrow, and I don't know of any examples. It might have been used, I just don't know of any examples of it. On the other hand, if one day you are elected to be governor of California, and I hope none of you are, but if one day you are elected to be governor of California, you will almost immediately face a recall election. They hate everybody they elect and try to fire them as soon as they do it. So California is always having recall elections. Our next piece of electoral reform comes in the primary election. So it's 2019. We are in a primary right now. A primary is the pre-election. It's the election before the election. And we're seeing it on the nationwide level because Donald Trump is standing for re-election, and there's about 30 Democrats who are trying to run against him, and they are currently trying to fight each other to emerge as the person the Democrats nominate for president. That's a primary election. It didn't even used to exist until 1899 when Minnesota invents this game. Before then, the party bigwigs would decide. All the Democrats would just get into a room together and say, who should we run this year? And they'd all like talk about it, and just like the bosses would have a conversation, and would eventually emerge that somebody would become their nominee. Yeah?
Is whoever's the outgoing president, they're like automatically on the ballot?
Well, until they're term limited. So Donald Trump, okay, that's a really good question. The party can do whatever they want. So there are like 4 Republicans who would like to challenge Trump and try to beat him in the primary. It doesn't look like they're going to get any traction, and a lot of states aren't even holding a primary because they're expensive, and they say, why would we hold an election that we know they're just going to elect Trump? So you rarely see a sitting president have an inter-party challenge. There are a few Republicans trying this year. They're not getting any traction. The last time I could think of it significantly was 1976. Ronald Reagan challenged Gerald Ford for the presidency, but that was kind of an odd situation. Gerald Ford won the primary. Reagan would have to go win again in 1980. So that's when Reagan would become president. So yeah, we'll talk about that next semester. It's super interesting.
Can you do 2 terms and then wait a term?
No, not in the conventional understanding. There's people that think they could sue for it, but I don't think there's anything there. 2 terms, that's it. You can't take one off and go, like we couldn't go redraft Obama to go run again.
That's because he's already served 8 years.
He's already served his time, his 2 terms, yeah. There was some speculation that he could run as vice president as long as the president didn't die.
Sammy, were you asking if you run 4 years, you can
Yeah.
like take a break and then run your other 4 again?
Yeah, he said like 8, take a break and go again. Yeah, that's not a
You
thing.
can do 4 break.
Grover Cleveland did it in our last unit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, our last piece of electoral reform is also power from the big guys handing it down to the little guys. And it's the 17th Amendment to the Constitution. Before the 17th Amendment, the United States Senate, so the upper house of Congress, we have a bicameral legislature with the Senate and the House of Representatives. The Senate used to be elected by the state legislatures. So our Congress in Topeka would pick who our senator was going to be. With the 17th Amendment, that was changed to let just everybody vote on it. And it was determined by popular election. But that didn't exist until the 17th Amendment. So it's actually a super important amendment, but it's not one of the sexy ones, so nobody knows anything about it.